Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
I've been thinking about non-compete agreements.
Oh, God, I thought it was going to be something good.
This is really good. A non-compete agreement is an agreement an employee signs as a condition of being employed that if the employee leaves, the employee will not take a job with any of the employer's competitors over some period of time, typically a year or two. Non-compete agreements came into vogue during the dot-com era of the late 1990s, when internet companies were struggling to grow as fast as possible because of network effects. That is, the more users a web service had, the more likely it was to attract even more users. Network effects are why, despite the fact that so many of us dislike Facebook, we keep using it. Even if a better competitor came along, without Facebook's large user base, the competing product won't be as useful. So, kind of in a perverse way, none of us like Facebook, but we keep using it because everybody else keeps using it. When you're a dot-com company looking to grow as quickly as you can, one of the worst things that can happen is that one of your employees goes to work for a competitor, taking with him or her all of the knowledge about your product. A competitor could shave months or even years off of product development time by poaching employees from a company that's further along in development. And so, dot-com companies would require that their employees promise not to work for a competitor for some period of time after leaving. That's the non-compete agreement. As the internet space matured, that need to grow fast quickly became less pressing. Yet non-compete agreements remained, and they appear to have become weaponized, such that employers now use them to prevent employees from demanding higher wages.
And we should be clear here that this goes way beyond just internet companies at this point.
These
are all over the place.
Yes, they're all over the place. A non-compete agreement makes it harder for workers to obtain competing offers to use as leverage in asking their current employers for raises. Imagine what would happen if, in order to buy a car from your local car dealer, you had to agree not to buy your next car from a competing dealership. Well, you wouldn't be able to comparison shop and so would find it much harder to negotiate your next car purchase. What's new here is that President Biden is pushing to ban non-compete agreements. Now, on the one hand, I'm against the government intruding itself into private contracts. On the other, I like symmetry. It seems to me that if the government is intent on weighing in on non-compete agreements, it should require that they apply in both directions. For example, if a worker is prohibited from going to work for a competing employer, then the company should be prohibited from hiring a competing worker. That is, the non-compete agreement should prohibit the employer from hiring to the same extent that it prohibits the worker from working.
That's probably never going to happen.
It's not going to happen, but I like it a lot better than simply banning the things. They are valuable.
Yeah, I guess. And I'm with you. The minute I see the government involving itself in anything regarding labor, I can feel my back tightening up already. And yet, when I think this one through, this really might be all right. There's probably perfectly legitimate reasons to have non-compete clauses, but in your opening, you said exactly the right thing. They become weaponized. This might surprise a lot of our listeners. I tend to fall on the side of workers, and I wonder why on earth most of them have to sign these things. And if that's the case, maybe they shouldn't have to at all. Maybe this is a case of employers using a level of power that they've got that the worker just can't match. I find that to be, at the very best, troubling. I've got something radically different. You know how I'm not a scientist, and yet the science things always kind of fascinate me when they come along. There's an epilepsy drug. It's a $3 a pill epilepsy drug, so it's not exactly an inexpensive thing, but it's not backbreakingly expensive either. Scientists have been playing around with it, feeding it to mice, and what they have found is that this already extant epilepsy drug turns off autism symptoms in mice.
Isn't that interesting?
They may have stumbled upon a very effective autism treatment. It's high time. There's nothing out there. Every now and then you see something like this and you think, Wow, that's actually going to be pretty interesting. And you know what, Ant? There's a lot of people in the United States right now. It's 2.2% of adults and 1 in 44 children. We've got an estimated 5.4 million people in the United States alone who could benefit, some very, very significantly.
And you said, what, $3 a pill?
Who wouldn't pay that?
Right.
You probably don't want to spend $100 a month on much of anything, but there are things you would quite clearly spend $100 a month on. And that's, I think, very clearly one of them. It's called lamotrigine. We'll put the link in the show notes and you can have a look at it yourself. But I'm just endlessly fascinated by this sort of thing.
I saw the article, the headline on this topic. What amazes me, I spend a lot of time just perusing the news, as I'm sure you do. Somewhere in the past couple of years, maybe even less than that, maybe in the past 12 months, I've been noticing more and more articles about really interesting scientific breakthroughs. Now, I don't know if that's just what my service is feeding me or if there's been some explosion in important discoveries.
I don't know either, but I read them with great delight when they come around. And then we have the foolishness of the week. And as good as I might be feeling about damn near anything, I want to talk about the California legislature yet again. The chief moron this time is Assemblyman Damon Connolly, Democrat from San Rafael. And he wants to ban the sale of tobacco products to anyone born after January 1st, 2007, forever.
Forever?
What the is wrong with these people? Because you know what I'm going to do the minute we're done here, Ant? I'm going to go outside and I'm going to smoke at least 4 cigars.
Just as a protest.
It's a Sunday as we record this. Of course I'm going to go outside and do that. Damon Connolly would prohibit that for an entire group of people who are today 15 and 16 forever.
I'm trying to figure out how this squares with California leading the charge in legalizing marijuana.
Yeah, because you could puff away on that all you want. New Zealand has a similar ban, apparently, for anyone born in 2009 or later. I'm just so agitated about this. Every time I think about it, I want to go slap people. No, I am moved to violence over this. I'm so tired of people telling other people what they can and cannot do.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. If you're a full-time college student looking for something educational, fun, and free, apply to join me and James and several faculty who have appeared on Words and Numbers at the inaugural summer seminar on the theory and practice of classical liberalism. The week-long seminar is hosted by the Stevenson Institute at Wabash University and will be held June 5th through the 10th. There's no charge, and meals and lodging are provided. To apply, see the link in the show notes. This week, James and I are at Walden Grove High School in Arizona, talking to economics and government students about inflation.
We thought maybe we would talk about inflation today, which I know you're not thinking, oh, thank God somebody's going to talk about inflation. You hear people complaining about it all the time. And I remember being 10, 11, 12, and it was the Carter years. Inflation was unbelievable, right? It was like 16, 17%. Every one of my aunts and uncles had no idea what to do next. They were in the middle of mortgages they couldn't afford with jobs they all of a sudden didn't have. We had about 8.5% inflation a year ago. Then it kept on going.
There's a couple things to think about as you think about inflation. And one is, James is right, I was looking at 2020 versus 2022. Over those 2 years combined, average price level in the United States went up 14%, so it's roughly 7% a year. The last time we had inflation that high was Carter years. So 40 years ago was 1982. Actually, the last time we got to 7%.
And we use the Carter years just as an explanatory device, right? Because it went well into the Reagan years.
Oh yeah, it's not a function of a president, but rather a function of a time.
And it's not a partisan thing either.
Yeah, so 40 years ago was the last time we saw inflation of this magnitude. And to give you some perspective of what's going on, economists were very concerned up until about 2-3 months ago that we might be in for 5% plus inflation for a long time. In fact, I was one of the economists that was saying, get ready for this to just be a normal thing. I was very surprised at what happened in December of 2022, so just a month and a half ago, prices actually came down. Now, it's a weird thing because people will say things like, you'll hear on the news, inflation in December was 6.5%. What they mean is prices in December were 6.5% higher than they were the previous December. So over the course of that year, prices went up 6.5%, which is correct. What was interesting to me is that if you look at just December 1st to December 31st, prices actually came down about 1% on an annualized basis. We actually experienced deflation. Now, it wasn't nearly enough deflation to compensate for the inflation we had over the past couple of years, but it was a fascinating thing to see prices actually come down. So I started looking to see to what extent have prices come down in the past, because we can say something like we've reached the end of inflation. I don't think we have, but suppose we have. Inflation is over. That doesn't mean we're back where we started, because inflation is over simply means the prices stop rising. To get them back where they were, you've got to go through deflation. So to get prices back to where they were 2 years ago, everything's got to come down 14%. You know the last time prices fell 14% in the United States? Never. Since 1950, we've only had 3 periods of deflation that have lasted for a year. And in each of those periods, deflation was maximum of 1% deflation. In short, prices aren't coming back down to where they were before. Their best case scenario is they stop rising. So what does it mean for you? I was running some numbers. Now, your minimum wage here just went up, didn't it? How many of you have jobs? So you were $12 an hour in Arizona, and as of January 1st, you're now $13.85, is that right? Yeah, $13.85.
That's fantastic money for young people.
Yeah, which sounds excellent.
You're shaking your head, but our friends in Kentucky are making $7.25.
Yeah, Kentucky is $7.25 an hour. Of course, cost of living is a little bit less.
Lower, sure.
But to go from $12 an hour to $13.85 sounds excellent until you realize that's about a 14% increase. In other words, you today at $13.85 an hour are no better off than you were 2 years ago at $12 an hour. You've got the same purchasing power when you're done.
Yeah, and I don't mind telling people that I was graced with a 3% raise this year.
Yeah, which puts you behind compared to last year.
I got a pay cut.
Yeah, you got a pay cut.
I did not keep up with inflation. That's actually kind of rough.
Yeah, it's one of the things that you'll find as you start to get experience and move beyond minimum wage, you start earning more. It's one of the things that happens is businesses, employers will take advantage. Be careful, I don't mean take advantage in the sense of they're doing something bad, but they will take advantage of the opportunity that prices are rising. They won't raise workers' wages in exchange unless they absolutely have to. And so consequently, they benefit. My employer did the same thing. I'm at a university. Tuition, of course, is higher. They're paying the faculty a little bit more, but they're not paying them as much as what tuition went up. So the university benefits.
You almost never keep pace from a certain point in your career on. And you have to budget that into your expectations.
And that's not to say you can never make yourself whole from inflation, but what it does mean is often the way you make yourself whole is by moving to another job.
That's right. We're going to talk about things and what they cost, and yet just because something costs more doesn't mean it's inflation. And I give you eggs. Right now, eggs will drive you crazy. They are so expensive, it's unbelievable. Prior to the recent period, we were getting a dozen eggs when they were on sale for $1.50.
Yeah, what are they now? Like $7,
$8.
Yeah.
The prices have started to come down.
Yeah.
But there were reasons for this. Right? There was a massive avian flu, and chickens were slaughtered wholesale, and the eggs just didn't come. And all of a sudden, those free-range chickens, the special brown eggs in the store, those were cheaper than the regular kind.
Yeah, and this is important because people will say things like that. They'll say, well, price of eggs went up or price of gas went up, that's inflation. That's not inflation. I mean, it might be due to inflation. It might partially be due to inflation or it might not be due to inflation at all. Inflation is a rise in the average price level. So always, some prices are going up, some prices are going down. What matters when you talk about inflation is the average of everything. So in the case of gas, we peaked at $5 a gallon, we're now down to 3 something. Price of eggs similarly coming down. Yeah. And that's due to, maybe some of it was due to inflation, but a large part of it was due to other things. The price of gas is war in the Ukraine. The eggs was avian flu. We had to kill a whole bunch of chickens, and now we have less eggs. We have a name for that. We call that a change in relative prices, which is not the same as inflation. But inflation is just rise in the average price level.
But let's actually think about inflation for a bit. We've got a group of young people in front of us, and they actually buy certain things, and those things are now going to cost more. Now, they got a raise just recently. The raise was sizable, but inflation is going to take a bite. Where do you land with some of the things that they actually care about? It's not eggs and gas that they care about.
One of the things I found interesting was a Big Mac. If you go back to when you were earning $12 an hour, minimum wage here, so 2 years ago, I looked up your taxes. Good God, do you pay a lot in taxes?
The taxes are high.
So your federal tax, if you're minimum wage, you're paying 10% income tax on what you earn. Arizona income tax, 2.6%, which is okay. It's less than Pennsylvania. We're 3.1. You got a payroll tax. That's a big deal. That's your tax that goes to Social Security, Medicare. That's 7.65%. That's the biggest tax you pay. But then here's where I was amazed. Arizona has a 5.6% sales tax. And this is the thing you don't think about.
Oh, it's 8% where I am.
Oh, no, I'm not done yet. You earn your money and you think about the tax that you have to pay when you earn money. But the whole point of earning money is to turn around and spend it, right? If you got to pay tax when you spend it as well. So you got to take that into account. Arizona State, 5.6. Tucson, another 3.1. So when you're done, for every $1 that you earn, 29 cents goes to some form of government. You get to keep the other, whatever that is. So
71%.
Yeah, it's a third. It's roughly a third of your paychecks going to government. So here's the interesting thing. James is looking for examples.
Yeah.
In 2020, when you were earning your $12 an hour minimum wage here, after all the taxes, including sales taxes, you got $8.50 worth of purchasing power, which was about what a Big Mac cost. So 1 hour of your work was equivalent to a Big Mac. Today, with 14% inflation, you need about $9.71 for the Big Mac, the Big Mac meal. That's $1.19 more. But then because of the increase in minimum wage, you're earning almost that much more. So your purchasing power is about the same. In 2020, an hour of your labor equal to a Big Mac. Today, an hour of your labor equal to a Big Mac.
And the Big Mac index is a thing.
Oh, it is a thing,
right?
Yeah.
Economists maintain the Big Mac index, and it's a wonderful proxy for how much money you've got, because you can look at what a Big Mac costs anywhere. Mm-hmm. You can go to other countries with the Big Mac index. It's really a good tool.
Also because a Big Mac is a standard thing. A Big Mac is a Big Mac is a Big Mac. It doesn't matter where you're buying it. It's a good metric to look at across countries. I want to go back to the 14% number. So from 2020 to now, your prices here have gone up 14%. That doesn't sound like much. I mean, it's a small number, right? It's not like 100% or something, 14%. Think about it in terms of time. Before inflation, you worked an hour and you earned whatever you earned. Today, with prices 14% more, to have the same purchasing power, you've got to work 14% more. So for every hour, you've got to add on 8 minutes. So in 2020, you work for an hour, you got some purchasing power. Today, you got to work an hour and 8 minutes to get the purchasing power. And again, 8 minutes, it doesn't sound like much, right? It's 8 minutes, not a big deal. Except, over the course of an 8-hour day, that's more than an hour. In other words, here's what inflation did for you. It had the same effect as if you were required to give up your lunch break and work on your lunch break now versus in 2020 you didn't. You have to work an extra hour a day to make the same purchasing power at the end of the day that you had back in 2020.
That's a colossal difference.
And when you're a student, and I'm sure some of you contribute to your household expenses, a lot of students don't. It's just spending money that you earn. It's bad enough. But if you've got a family and a house and a mortgage payment and a car payment, and all of a sudden everything, on average, everything's 14% more, you've got a big problem now.
Yeah. And I can tell you, almost everybody I know had to sit down and have a very difficult conversation that started with, okay, we can't afford it all anymore.
What are we going to cut?
What are we going to give up? And I remember doing it just for fun at my house, asking people, all right, what would you give up? Because things could get much worse and we might have to do that. And I got a lot of pushback on that conversation.
James and I say a lot of bad things about government. We also say some good things about government. But one of the negatives about government is that they don't have, the people who are in Congress and the president, people who make the laws, who make the tax laws and decide on spending, they don't have the incentive to do what James just described, or what you all in your households do. Of prices are higher, now you're going to make some tough decisions. We can't afford all of this. We can only afford that part. We're going to cut this. Congress tends not to do that.
Yeah, Congress doesn't do that. What does Congress do? Congress decides we're going to keep doing everything we want to do, and we're going to add more things that we want to do, and we're going to do that too. And how are we going to pay for it? Print more money. And every time you add money to the money supply, every dollar you have in the money supply is worth less.
There's that, or alternatively, you just simply borrow. You say, well, we can borrow. Yeah, but every dollar that you borrow, either you've got to eventually pay it back, or if you're not going to pay it back, you've got to pay interest on it.
Forever.
So every dollar that the government borrows, it has to tax us more in the future to pay the interest on that money that it borrowed.
And you see what starts to emerge here, and this is why Ant says there's more inflation coming.
Because we tighten our belts, but government doesn't have to. Or I should say, it should have to, but it doesn't have to.
And two things happen every year that you can monitor. You can go and look at the official documents. You can go to any number of websites that reprint this for you. The government, every single year, takes in more money. I think that's true since the 1950s.
Well, I could tell you, I know because I looked it up just the other day. In the same 2 years that we've experienced 14% inflation, the federal government's tax revenues have gone up. Any guess by how much?
Well, I'm guessing somewhere near 14%.
How much?
14%.
Much more than that.
That was my guess too.
40%.
Oh, come.
Federal tax revenues are 40% higher today than they were 2 years ago.
Boy, now I'm really cheesed. Every year the government takes in more money, and you would think, okay, if that's true, then there should be no budget problem. If you had a job and every single year you got a massive raise, and then one time you got a 40% raise, you should think that we will not have any problems with deficits or debt.
Right.
And yet every year the debt gets bigger too. It's gotten bigger every year since 1952.
Yeah, and the reason you see this is because of the difference between a government and a household. With a household, particularly if you went through bad times, you had to borrow some money, whatever it is, and all of a sudden your income starts to go up. What do? You pay off that debt. You get it back under control. With government, you can see this in the numbers. Every time it gets another dollar of revenue, and often politicians will say, we've got to raise taxes because we've got this debt. We want to raise taxes so we can close the deficit, pay the debt down, all of this. Every time government gets more tax revenue, it turns around and spends it. Actually, it is the case, if you give the government more revenue, you make our financial problems worse because it ends up spending that on top of.
Isn't it about $1.20 for every dollar?
It's like roughly $1.15 for every extra dollar they get. The next year they spend $1.15 more. But notice, it's an interesting thing, and we were talking about this earlier during the lunch break. What we're describing, how should I say, it's not a failure of government, it's an understandable consequence. Because think about what politicians' goals are. We'd like their goals to be to do what's in our best interest, to be financially prudent. That's not their goal. Their goal is to get elected. And how do they get elected? By getting you to vote. I want you to vote for me. How do I get you to vote for me? I promise you stuff. How do I get the money to pay for stuff? Well, we raise taxes. Or we borrow. We do that, and then you elect me. I have an incentive to spend more and more money because it's what gets me elected, even if I know it's a bad idea. Because if I don't promise to spend more money so that you elect me, he will. And then you'll elect him.
Why was it that exactly around the last election, all we heard about was student loan forgiveness? We're going to forgive all your student loans. Where on earth is that money coming from?
Well, interestingly, because it turned out to not be constitutional.
Yeah.
Joe Biden knew it, and I'm not picking on Joe Biden because Joe Biden, I'd pick on any politician. He happened to be the one that said it. At the time when he was running, he said, I'm not sure this is constitutional. Or he said, rather, I don't think the government has the power to do this, forgive student loans. And yet he pushed it anyway. Why? Because it attracted votes.
It was election season.
Yeah.
He stopped as soon as it was over, and then he replaced it with this tiny sliver of a forgiveness program that almost nobody in the world qualified for. Right. And you start to see how disingenuous this sort of thing is. But the real problem is that the people who make the rules never have any consequences for making terrible rules. They don't have to pay for their mistakes.
And so one of the things that happens is they borrow a lot of money. Another thing that happens, and this is what happened during COVID, it's why we're dealing with the inflation, is the government borrowed so much money. It borrowed more than what, I was about to say they borrowed more than the markets could handle. It's not that the government borrowed more than the markets could handle. It's that the government borrowed so much that if the markets handled it, interest rates would have risen. The Federal Reserve stepped in and bought up a bunch of that debt so that interest rates wouldn't rise. What happens when the Federal Reserve buys federal debt? It injects dollars into the economy. That's what gave us the inflation. The inflation we're experiencing over these past 2 years is precisely due to the financing of the federal spending during COVID.
And it was so easily predicted that this was going to happen.
Yeah. Well, we said back in March of 2020, expect inflation. In fact, we said expect at least 5% inflation, which indeed we got.
And actually, I'm a little surprised it was as light as it became. I'm worried about what happens next. But for now, I think inflation is likely in a box that it won't get out of.
So I want to talk as well about what people call informally shrinkflation, which you may have noticed. I'll give you one example here. I'll give you a couple examples. Burger King, you have Burger Kings here, reduced its chicken nuggets from 10 to 8. When you order chicken nuggets, you used to get 10, now you get 8. For the same price, it averages $4.49. It's an interesting thing. The price of chicken nuggets hasn't gone up, but you get fewer of them.
It's 20% inflation.
Yeah, but it's actually 20% inflation, because when we calculate inflation, we don't simply look at the price tag of, well, chicken nuggets were $4.49, they're now $4.49, no inflation. That's not what we do. We compare also the quantity of what you're getting. So economists will say $4.49 chicken nuggets, you got 10 of them. Now $4.49, you only get 8. That's 20% inflation. And in fact, that is, if the price didn't go up, but you got less. That's shrinkflation.
This stupid Burger King.
Well,
and look, I go to the store now, and you know that this is a thing, because when I want to buy something, I pick it up and feel it.
Right, yeah.
All right, how light is it this time?
Gatorade did an interesting thing. Any of you buy Gatorade?
Gross.
So here's the interesting, they redesigned their bottle. And they said it's now ergonomic and it's cool looking. Instead of doing this, it goes in and does that. Yeah, but in doing that, they shaved off several ounces of Gatorade. About 15% of the Gatorade is now not there.
And see, everybody's got to make up this 14% somehow. This is going to be the goal, and there are only so many ways you can make it up.
Yeah, you can raise your prices, which of course you feel directly in the form of inflation. The problem is psychologically, if Gatorade raised the price of Gatorade, you're likely not to buy it, to buy something else instead. But if they make the bottle look nicer and you don't realize that you're actually getting less for the same price, you're more likely to go ahead and buy the thing. So they're playing this psychological game, in effect hiding the inflation and the reduction of the magnitude of the product, hoping you don't notice.
And you can also fire workers or cut back their hours.
Yeah.
And that's a direct result, because businesses have to remain profitable or they don't remain at all. I mean, there are only so many ways that you can make up for this, and they're all unpleasant.
One of the things that politicians like to say is they like to blame the inflation on companies, corporate profits. Corporate profits are so high, and that's what's causing the inflation. And what they will typically do is cherry pick a particular industry. Let's say, look at this industry. They made a ton of profits. I think oil is the latest thing. Oil profits were high. It was Amazon. Amazon profits were so high. And what happens is, throughout COVID, those industries' profits were remarkably low. And now as we're bouncing back, their profits are remarkably high. If you average it out from COVID all the way up till now, the average profit is about what it typically is. So what you're seeing, this high profit, is simply a bounce back from the low profits of COVID. Do you know what the average business profit is in the United States?
People tend to get this one wrong by a country mile.
It's 6%. The average company makes a 6% profit.
The average answer that you get when you ask that question is 30. For whatever the reason, people think American businesses return 30% a year.
Yeah, it's 6%. And when you look at stores you typically deal with, so think about retail stores, grocery stores, this kind of thing. Their profit margins, Walmart's profit margins, 1%. For every dollar you put down the counter at Walmart, Walmart actually makes 1 penny. The other 99 cents goes to costs.
Walmart's business model is to do a volume business.
Right.
They build lots of stores. They want to bring lots of people in. They're gigantic, right? And if they're not going to make a lot of money on each sale, they're going to make a lot of sales.
Right.
And make a little bit of money. And it turned out that's a winning business model for them. Mm-hmm. They've made this work for decades now. Grocery stores operate on a 2-3% margin at best. So when you walk into a grocery store and you think, how can I afford this? And that's what I thought when I was in a grocery store last week. I hadn't been grocery shopping in a while, and I got sticker shock. Everything was so much more expensive. And yet you realize the grocery store isn't making a lot of money. They're making 1 to 3%, that's it.
The 6%, to put this in perspective, that's the average profit margin for a company in the United States. That's very slim. You might look at it and say, well, but that's 6% they're making. They could pay their workers more and take 4%. But remember what's going on here. That return that the company makes, that goes to the investors in exchange for the risk that they take on in financing the company. And if you start to squeeze that and say, well, you don't get 6%, you get 4%, a lot of investors are going to say, you know what, for the risk here, my money's better off somewhere else. And they don't invest. And then you don't get a company.
And people don't realize that when you buy stock, you're taking on risk. The amount of risk is priced into the stock. The riskier things you get a better deal on, the solid things you don't. And if you squeeze investors out, you're going to squeeze so hard that American businesses aren't going to work because they won't have access to capital when they need it. Mm-hmm. So when you look at this 6% return, you have to realize that there are a lot of people out there really working hard for a very minimal return.
That's worth talking about, actually. Do you know what the average CEO makes in the United States?
Yeah, the evil CEOs, the mega-rich people who are to blame and how they have to pay for the debt that we have incurred over these years.
And there's a theme here. When people get concerned about inflation, politicians will point. In fact, I've seen them point to a whole slew of things, none of which is the cause of inflation.
It's that weasel Jeff Bezos.
Right. One of the things, they'll talk about the tens of millions of dollars that CEOs make. And again, you're getting cherry picking. They're pointing to a handful of CEOs who are at the very top. It's like saying basketball players are really talented. Am I saying, how do you know that? And you point to NBA stars. Say, look at how these perform. Yeah, you're pointing to 5 people out of thousands of basketball players across the country. You're cherry picked. If you look at all CEOs in the United States, not just the top ones, the average CEO makes
230, 240.
Yeah, 200, just over 200, 250, somewhere in that range, 200, 250,000, which for a bunch of high school students sounds like a tremendous amount.
Well, it sounds like a tremendous amount to me, too.
It is a decent amount, but it's not multi-tens of millions of dollars.
No, that's right. And simple fact of this matter is I was the CEO for 3 years? It was just a job.
Right, yeah.
Right, just a job. A very small organization. You do what you can and you move on. And did I make anywhere near even the average? No, of course not. And that's true of a lot of the CEOs in this country. When they get singled out and blamed for having too much money, it seems to be their only crime, you're really not saying much of anything. And here's how you know. The billionaires are evil, and we all get agitated when we think about them. If you took every dollar that every billionaire had, I don't mean taxing them a lot, I mean literally confiscating every single thing.
Not just their dollars, their stock, their houses, their yachts, everything.
Everything. If you took them away and left them with nothing and applied all that money to the federal government, you would pay off roughly 9 months of the federal budget.
Yeah, it would fund the government for about 9 months.
9 months. Imagine taking everything away from an entire class of people. They couldn't fund the government for 1 year. And then when you went to look for more people to do it the next year, you wouldn't have any billionaires anymore because you've already confiscated all of their wealth.
Let me leave you with a little bit of happy news. Inflation, roughly speaking, this is very roughly speaking, inflation is the growth in the money supply minus the growth in productivity. You know it is real GDP. Growth in the money supply minus the growth in productivity. Roughly speaking, that's inflation. So 2 ways to fight inflation. One is you don't print more money. You keep your money supply constrained. Of course, that seems not to be happening. But the other way to fight inflation is you get your productivity up. You start producing more and more stuff. Once in a while, something happens that causes us to become massively more productive and helps to keep the inflation down. One of the first things that happened was the westward expansion in this country. Much more land, we start using it, we start becoming more productive. Another thing, the Industrial Revolution, where all of a sudden one person could do the work that 12 used to do. In our times, the invention of the internet, and now you can do things in a matter of minutes that used to take days to do. The next thing I think is coming, and you start to see the whispers of it now, is artificial intelligence. As that moves out of its baby phase into an actual useful phase, all of a sudden I think you will see that same jump in productivity that the internet gave us. And all of a sudden now, you've got growth in money supply minus growth in productivity. And growth in productivity becomes much bigger. And that's going to keep inflation much more constrained.
You wonder what impact AI is going to have on life generally. It's a wild card right now. We know that it's likely to be a pretty good aid in important things in the not too distant future. It's not ready for prime time yet. It turns out it's really bad at math.
It's horrible at math.
It turns out it's not so politically neutral. Yeah. There are all kinds of assumptions baked into it that have clearly been programmed by other people, and they have severe limitations. But that said, it does process language in a very impressive way.
Have any of you messed around with artificial intelligence? Just one of you, two? Is that all? Get on there. You get ChatGPT. You can get online. You can just mess with it. You can ask it questions, whatever. Here's the thing to be careful of. It speaks like you're speaking to a person. I mean, in text form. And if you ask it a question, it will very confidently give you an answer. I gave it a complex thing actually in statistics. It's one of the word problems I gave to my statistics students. There's all this convoluted stuff here, and I gave the question, what's the probability of whatever it is? And the thing comes back and it tells me in very confident terms, well, this and this and this, and you calculate this and you use this over here, and the answer is X. I went back to it, I said, no, in step 3, you assume these two events are independent, you can't assume that. And it comes back and says, all right, quite right. So all this stuff, and it's giving me all these words, and it says at the end, and because of this, you can't find the answer. Again, very confidently. It's also incorrect about that. You can find the answer, right? So it's one of the problems is it's going to be very confident about its wrongness. But one of the interesting things is, as James says, how it deals with language. So James and I write op-eds all the time for newspapers, and I wrote one a couple of weeks ago. I always get stuck on the closing paragraph. I write the whole thing, and then, the closing paragraph, I just can't do it. So what I did, I took my article, it was about, whatever it was, 800 words, put it into ChatGPT, the artificial intelligence. I said, hey, look at this. Write me a closing paragraph. And it did. And it was a reasonable paragraph. But it wasn't good enough. So I said, make it more punchy. I literally said that, make it more punchy. And it did. It came back with something that was much better. I said, this is good. I said, I like this better. I'm telling it this. I like this better, but you repeat the phrase, and there was some phrase it repeated. I said this. I said, that's no good. So it rewrites it, substituting in something different for the phrase. And at the end, I got this paragraph that was really darn good from an artificial intelligence.
Did you use it?
No, I didn't use it.
Because that would be plagiarism. That's cheating.
Would it? I don't know.
Yeah, can you plagiarize a non-human source becomes the question.
Yeah.
And professors are wrestling with this right now. We have friends all over the country who want to know if the papers their students are turning in were written by ChatGPT.
Yeah.
I mean, where did this paper come from? And you might not be able to tell anymore.
But here's the great increase in productivity that's coming, and it's coming in the next 5 years. When you all hit the job market, that's going to be when it's in its prime time. And here's the growth in productivity. You won't need to know how to do things. You need to know what questions to ask.
Yeah, that's right. I used to tell my students, I don't care if you memorize this. You don't have to. But you have to know where to go to find the answer. Mm-hmm. And that was very hard in the days when there were books and libraries with card catalogs. Then the internet comes along. Now you have to know the correct sequence of words to enter into a search to get the answers that you need given what you're trying to research.
Right.
And that's a skill too. Mm-hmm. Right? You don't have to memorize everything, but boy, to drill down and get what you need is extraordinarily difficult. And it takes a long time to learn that skill. And now all of a sudden we're going to do it again, except it applies more widely. And what you find is with each advance in any form of technology like this, it gets wider every time. And now people are terrified of it because it's finally gotten so wide that they're convinced it's going to cost them their jobs.
And here's the thing to be careful of. People say, in this case artificial intelligence, be careful about it because it's going to put a bunch of people out of work. Human beings have been repeating that phrase as long as there have been inventions.
And they start with, but this time it's different.
Yeah, and every time they say, no, but this time it's different. It really put people out of work. And every single time, we've been not only wrong, we have been magnificently wrong. Yeah. Think about the world today. Highly automated robots and machines and doing everything they do compared to 150 years ago when everything was done by hand. And yet, Today's economy employs more than 10 times the number of people that the economy 150 years ago employed.
When Ant and I were teenagers, ATMs were invented. And everybody was utterly convinced everybody who was a bank teller was going to be put out of work.
One of the things people said is it's going to put tellers out of work, bank tellers, because that makes sense, right? Because the ATM can dispense cash, you don't need to employ bank tellers. It actually caused an increase in the number of bank teller jobs. It was a positive unintended consequence. And here's why. Before the ATM, to open a bank, I had to employ a bunch of tellers. Now with an ATM, I can open a bank and I don't have to employ a bunch of tellers, I can employ just a few tellers. And it became worthwhile to open branches in rural areas where they never had banks before. And so, yeah, in the banks that had a lot of tellers, the ATM cut some of them out of the job market. They lost their jobs. But that was more than compensated for by the new branches that opened that employed tellers.
Yeah, many, many times over.
Yeah.
And what you find is that this happens so often, and we're utterly convinced every time that this time it's going to be different. We've got another great example of this. People have been saying since at least the 18th century with Thomas Malthus that the world is overpopulated. If you ask young people what the biggest problem in the world is, it's environmental stuff on the one hand and overpopulation on the other. And they really end up going hand in glove. The world is not overpopulated at all.
The way we know it's not overpopulated is because today we have, compared to a century ago, about 10 times the number of people, or maybe compared to 2 centuries ago, about 10 times the number of people on the planet. Yeah, because 2 centuries ago was 1 billion, today we're 8 billion, so 8 times the number of people, much more people. Today, less than 10% of the human beings live in extreme poverty. Do you know what fraction of human beings lived in extreme poverty 200 years ago? 98%. Our population is 8 times what it was, and yet the number of people living in extreme poverty has gone down by a factor of 10.
And look, living in extreme poverty is only one measure, and we can tell you we've done the work, we've looked at all the other measures, and there's really no evidence to support the idea that we've got an overpopulation problem. Yet every generation, somebody writes a book that says, oh God, the sky is falling, we're all going to die because of overpopulation, and people have a panic about it. Thanks for hanging out with us today. It's really been great. Keep in touch. Follow us on the podcast if you like. You can find us a million other ways. We're on Facebook and Twitter, and we're always pretty accessible. So, we'd like to hear from you from time to time. And if you ever have questions, feel free to ask. We'll always do our best to help you out. And that's all we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week when we'll say other things. In the meantime, you can join us on Words and Numbers Backstage, where the conversation continues. And you should join us there because, Ant, you might remember a while back when my dreams actually came true. Remember, I used to say things like, I can't believe that if Amazon or some other company delivers stuff to your house and it's not something you ordered, you get to keep it. Remember, I was all fascinated by this. And then I said, why is it that they never just drop off watches for me? Because I love watches. And then they dropped off a watch for me, and I couldn't believe it. Somebody else ordered a watch, and I got it. And it was the shittiest damn watch I've ever seen in my life. So I'm going to give it away to one lucky listener on Words and Numbers Backstage, and you should join so you can get your hat into the ring. Maybe we'll include a JamesRHarrigan prize pack with that.
JamesRHarrigan reject.
I am renowned for the things that I can shove into a box and send off to a total stranger. You can also follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. And you can
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
I wish you wouldn't, because it gets mixed up with all the spam that I get because of this stupid thing that Antony set up. But anyway, we'll see you next week. And, I haven't been saying this lately, and I've noticed a remarkable decline in manners. Please be nice to each other. Please. It doesn't take much. Just try. You don't even have to commit to being nice. Just try. Ant, I'll see you next week.
See you next week, James.